Welcome to the Dark Ledger, where history's darkest secrets are finally revealed. The plantation house stood as a symbol of order and certainty, its white columns rising above the fields, as if nothing beneath them could ever challenge their permanence. From the outside, it appeared calm, prosperous, untouched by doubt. Inside, however, the owner's wife lived with a quiet unrest that settled into her bones long before she could give it a name. She had learned early in her marriage that silence was often safer than speech, that questions, especially those that unsettled a man's pride, were best swallowed and forgotten. Yet some thoughts refused to be buried. They lingered, growing heavier with time, shaping the way she observed the world around her. Her suspicions did not arrive suddenly, nor were they dramatic enough to demand immediate attention. They came instead as small disturbances in the rhythm of daily life, details so subtle that she herself questioned whether they mattered at all. A glance held for a second too long, a pause in conversation when she entered a room, the way certain footsteps seemed to retreat whenever she appeared at the edge of the corridor. These moments were easy to dismiss, and she often did, telling herself that her mind was inventing patterns where none existed. Still, the unease remained, persistent and quietly exhausting. She noticed how one man in particular seemed woven into the household's routines more deeply than others. He was not family, nor was he ever invited to the table, yet his presence lingered in ways that felt unusual. He appeared when tasks required trust, vanished when authority approached, and somehow always knew more about the household's inner workings than he should have. His eyes, calm and observant, seemed to absorb everything without revealing a single thought in return. At first, she paid him little attention. There were many men like him on the plantation, necessary yet invisible. But over time, his presence became harder to ignore, like a shadow that refused to detach itself from the walls. Her husband, by contrast, moved through the house with absolute certainty. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never been questioned in any way that truly mattered. The plantation, the land, the people who worked it, all were extensions of his will. In his mind, order was natural, obedience expected, and loyalty unquestioned. He believed in clear boundaries, what belonged to him and what did not, who spoke and who listened. His wife, though respected as the lady of the house, existed within these boundaries as well. Her role was to manage appearances, maintain grace, and trust in his judgment without challenge. It was this certainty that made her doubts feel so dangerous. She understood the weight of her husband's laughter, how it could flatten concerns before they ever took shape. He laughed easily and often, especially at anything that threatened his sense of control. To him, doubt was weakness, and weakness was something to be corrected, not explored. She had seen him dismiss the worries of others with a single amused glance, reducing genuine fear to something trivial. The thought of becoming the target of that same mockery filled her with hesitation. Still, the feeling refused to fade. It followed her through the long afternoons when the house fell quiet and the heat pressed against the walls. It accompanied her during evenings when conversation at the table flowed smoothly, yet something beneath the words felt strained. She found herself watching rather than participating, listening for changes in tone, searching faces for meanings she could not quite define. Even in moments of solitude, the unease remained, whispering that something fundamental was shifting beneath the carefully maintained surface of their lives. She began to question herself more than anyone else. Was this simply loneliness, a result of too much time spent inside a world that offered little room for thought beyond routine? She had heard stories of women who imagined betrayals where none existed, their minds turning inward until suspicion became obsession. She feared becoming one of them. Yet the doubts she felt did not carry the wildness of imagination. They were quiet, methodical, rooted in observation rather than fantasy. That distinction mattered to her, even if she could not yet explain it to anyone else. When she finally spoke to her husband, it was not with accusation, but with caution. She chose her words carefully, framing her concerns as questions rather than claims. She mentioned changes she could not explain, patterns she had noticed, a sense of unease she could not shake. She hoped, perhaps foolishly, that he might listen, not because he believed her immediately, but because he trusted her enough to consider the possibility that something lay beyond his understanding. Instead, he laughed. His laughter was not cruel, but it was dismissive, heavy with confidence. He told her she worried too much, that her thoughts were shaped by idle time and unnecessary reflection. He reminded her of his position, his name, his unquestioned authority. Nothing within his house, he insisted, could exist beyond his knowledge. The idea that something or someone might escape his notice struck him as absurd. He kissed her forehead with indulgent affection, as one might soothe a nervous child, and moved on as though the matter was settled. She did not press the issue. Years of experience had taught her the futility of arguing against certainty so deeply ingrained. Yet his laughter stayed with her long after the conversation ended. It echoed in her thoughts, transforming her doubts into something heavier, more isolating. She realized then that her suspicions were not merely about what she had observed, but about what her husband refused to see. His certainty left no room for complexity, no space for truths that did not align with his version of the world. As days passed, her awareness sharpened rather than softened. She noticed how carefully some people avoided her gaze, how conversations seemed to adjust when her husband entered the room. She sensed a shared understanding among others, something unspoken yet widely acknowledged, that excluded her entirely. This realization did not bring clarity, but it intensified her isolation. She was surrounded by people, yet profoundly alone in her understanding of the household's undercurrents. At night, when the house settled into uneasy stillness, she lay awake listening to sounds that felt newly significant. Footsteps in the distance, doors opening and closing, murmurs carried by the night air. Each sound fed her sense that life within the plantation followed rules more complex than the ones her husband believed governed it. She wondered how many truths existed beyond his reach, hidden not out of malice but out of necessity. Her suspicions began to feel less like accusations and more like warnings, signals that something inevitable was approaching. She did not yet know what form it would take, only that it would force itself into the open eventually. Truth, she believed, had a way of surfacing no matter how deeply it was buried. The question that haunted her was not whether this truth would emerge, but what it would cost when it did. In moments of reflection, she questioned her own role in the unfolding tension. Was her silence a form of complicity? By allowing her husband's laughter to close the conversation, had she surrendered her responsibility to speak? These thoughts troubled her deeply. Yet she felt powerless to change the dynamic that defined their marriage. Her voice, when raised against certainty, seemed to dissolve before it could make an impact. Still, she continued to observe, to remember, to connect details that others overlooked. She trusted that one day these fragments would form a picture too clear to deny. Until then, she carried her suspicion quietly, aware that it marked the beginning of something irreversible. What had started as a faint unease had grown into a steady presence, shaping her understanding of the world she inhabited. Unbeknownst to her husband, who remained comfortably amused by the idea of doubt, the foundations of his certainty were already under strain. The laughter that dismissed her concerns had not erased them, it had merely postponed their reckoning. And within the walls of the plantation house, beneath its appearance of control and permanence, a truth waited patiently for the moment it could no longer remain hidden. After that first conversation, the plantation owner seemed almost energized by his own dismissal of doubt. His laughter lingered in the house like an aftertaste, shaping the way he carried himself and the way he addressed his wife thereafter. What had once been indulgent amusement hardened into something sharper, a confidence reinforced by mockery. He behaved as though the very act of laughing at her suspicions had reaffirmed his authority, not just over the land and the people who worked it, but over reality itself. To him, truth was something he defined, not something that emerged independently of his will. In the days that followed, he made a habit of turning her concerns into casual jokes. At breakfast, he would remark on how a woman's mind could wander when left idle for too long. In the evenings, when guests visited, he entertained them with stories about how easily fear could take root in a household if imagination was allowed too much freedom. He never mentioned her by name, yet the meaning was unmistakable. Each laugh from his audience reinforced his certainty, while each smile she forced in response felt like a small erasure of her voice. This mockery was not loud or overtly cruel, it was refined, wrapped in charm and wit. That, perhaps, made it more painful. He presented himself as patient and reasonable, a man humoring the fragile nerves of his wife. Anyone watching from the outside would have seen a husband gently correcting unnecessary worry. No one saw how carefully his words were chosen to establish dominance, to remind her, and everyone else, that doubt had no place in his world. His confidence rested not only on power, but on the assumption that power made him immune to being wrong. His pride had deep roots, nourished by years of unquestioned authority. He had inherited land, status, and a name that commanded respect long before he ever earned it himself. From a young age, he was taught that leadership was not something to be debated, but something to be obeyed. Challenges were seen as disruptions, not opportunities for reflection. In such a framework, his wife's suspicions could only be interpreted as a personal failing, hers, not his. To acknowledge them would be to admit that his control was incomplete, and that was a possibility he simply could not accept. As his arrogance grew more visible, so did the distance between him and his wife. He spoke to her less as a partner and more as a responsibility, something to be managed rather than understood. He reassured her with words that sounded gentle but carried finality, closing off discussion rather than inviting it. When she attempted to revisit the subject, he interrupted with humor, steering the conversation elsewhere. Over time, she learned that silence was not just safer, but expected. The household absorbed this dynamic quietly. Those who lived and worked within the plantation walls became increasingly careful in their interactions, measuring every word, every glance. They saw the way the owner dismissed his wife's concerns and understood the message it sent. If her voice held no weight, then theirs held none at all. Yet beneath this enforced calm, awareness spread. People noticed what he refused to acknowledge. They exchanged looks heavy with meaning, communicating in gestures rather than speech. The owner mistook this silence for harmony, never realizing it was built on restraint rather than loyalty. He took pride in the image he projected, a man in full command of his domain, untroubled by doubt or uncertainty. This image became something he performed daily, especially in front of others. He hosted gatherings with renewed enthusiasm, eager to display his confidence. He spoke of lineage, legacy, and order, weaving his certainty into every conversation. In doing so, he convinced himself further that nothing could disrupt the structure he believed so solid. The idea that something might already be unraveling beneath the surface never crossed his mind. His wife, meanwhile, watched this performance with a growing sense of dread. Each joke at her expense reminded her how isolated she had become. She began to understand that his laughter was not merely a reaction but a defense, one that protected him from confronting anything that challenged his authority. The more he laughed, the more he revealed his fear of vulnerability, though he would never have recognized it as such. To her, his mockery felt less like strength and more like a refusal to engage with reality. At times, his arrogance extended beyond words into action. He made decisions unilaterally, emphasizing his role as the final arbiter of all matters. He dismissed advice from those who had served the plantation for decades, trusting his instincts above all else. This pattern reinforced his belief that intuition and experience were interchangeable, that listening was optional when one held power. Each decision made without consultation deepened his sense of invincibility, even as it isolated him further from the truth unfolding around him. There were moments when his wife wondered if he truly believed his own laughter, or if it was a performance meant to convince himself as much as others. In private, she sometimes caught glimpses of restlessness, a brief pause, a distracted gaze that suggested uncertainty lurking beneath the surface. But these moments passed quickly, buried under renewed confidence. He could not afford doubt, not even in solitude. To doubt would be to fracture the image he depended on so completely. The culture of the time supported him unquestioningly. A man's word, especially one of his standing, was treated as fact. A woman's intuition, no matter how carefully considered, was easily dismissed as emotional or irrational. This imbalance gave his mockery legitimacy, allowing him to cloak arrogance in social acceptance. He knew this, whether consciously or not, and used it to his advantage. The world, as he understood it, was Desig. Ned to affirm him. Yet, even as he reveled in his certainty, cracks began to form in subtle ways. The laughter that once came easily grew sharper, more frequent, as though he needed to reinforce his confidence constantly. He repeated the same jokes, the same assurances, as if repetition could solidify truth. Those around him noticed the change, though few would have dared to name it. His pride, once effortless, now required maintenance. His wife sensed this shift and found little comfort in it. Rather than feeling vindicated, she felt increasingly burdened. The weight of what she suspected and what he refused to consider pressed heavily on her. She realized that his arrogance was not just dismissing her concerns, but setting the stage for a far greater reckoning. The more firmly he clung to certainty, the more devastating its collapse would be. In quiet moments, she reflected on how laughter had become his shield. It protected him from vulnerability, from listening, from acknowledging that power did not equate to omniscience. But shields, she knew, could not stop everything. Some truths did not arrive loudly or violently. They emerged slowly, patiently, waiting for the precise moment when denial could no longer sustain itself. As days turned into weeks, the plantation continued to function outwardly as it always had. Crops were tended, meals were served, routines maintained. To an outsider, nothing seemed amiss. But beneath this orderly surface, tension coiled tightly, fueled by arrogance and silence. The owner's mockery had not erased doubt, it had merely driven it deeper, where it grew stronger, gathering momentum. His laughter, once a symbol of confidence, had become a warning, though he was the only one who failed to hear it. Each dismissive remark pushed the truth further from conversation but closer to inevitability. And while he stood convinced of his unshack, able authority, those around him understood something he did not. Pride could delay truth, but it could never prevent its arrival. The day of the child's birth arrived beneath a sky heavy with heat, the kind that pressed down on the land and made even the air feel restless. From early morning, the plantation house stirred with controlled urgency. Footsteps moved more quickly than usual along the corridors, voices dropped into hushed tones, and doors opened and closed with careful precision. What should have been a moment of celebration carried instead an unspoken tension, as though everyone sensed that something irreversible was about to occur. The owner moved through the house with practiced confidence, issuing instructions, maintaining the appearance of calm, certain that this day would reinforce the order he believed defined his life. His wife lay upstairs, surrounded by women whose faces revealed more concern than joy. Labor stretched on longer than expected, each passing hour deepening the silence below. The owner waited, pacing occasionally, but never allowing worry to show. He reassured himself with the same certainty he had relied on for years. A child, he believed, would be proof of lineage, of control, of continuity. Whatever unease had lingered in recent months would be quieted by the undeniable reality of blood and name. As the hours dragged on, the house seemed to hold its breath. Even those accustomed to hardship felt the weight of the moment. Servants exchanged quick glances, saying little, aware that their expressions might reveal more than words ever could. Somewhere beneath the surface of routine, expectation twisted into apprehension. The truth, long contained within whispers and glances, seemed to press against the walls, waiting for release. When the cry of the newborn finally pierced the air, it did not bring immediate relief. Instead, it felt like a signal, sharp and unavoidable. The women upstairs moved quickly, their expressions shifting as they examined the child. Silence followed, too long, too deliberate. The owner, alerted at once, straightened his posture and prepared himself for the moment he had anticipated with such confidence. He expected congratulations, smiles, affirmation. What he received instead was hesitation. When he was finally invited into the room, the atmosphere had changed. His wife lay exhausted, her face pale, her eyes distant. The child rested nearby, wrapped carefully, small and impossibly still. For a brief moment, the owner felt a surge of triumph simply at the sight of the infant. This was his legacy, he told himself, the continuation of everything he had built and defended. He stepped closer, extending his arms without hesitation. As the child was placed in his hands, the room seemed to narrow around him. At first he noticed only the fragility of the small body, the warmth, the faint movement. Then his gaze settled on the child's face, and something inside him faltered. The eyes, open just enough to reveal their color, caught the light in a way that felt wrong. Not unfamiliar in a vague sense, but wrong in a precise, undeniable way. They did not mirror his own, nor did they resemble those of his family. Instead, they carried a depth and shade that awakened an uncomfortable recognition. He adjusted his grip, angling the child slightly, hoping the light was deceiving him. But the impression did not fade. The eyes remained steady and unmistakable. Around him, the room stayed silent, as though everyone present understood the significance of what he was seeing. No one spoke, no one offered reassurance. The absence of explanation pressed down harder than any accusation could have. For the first time in years, his laughter failed him. The confident remarks he had once used dismissed doubt, refused to surface. His mind searched desperately for alternatives, chance, coincidence, anything that could preserve certainty. But the more he looked, the more the truth resisted interpretation. These eyes carried a familiarity that did not belong to him. They suggested another presence, another story intersecting with his own in a way he had never allowed himself to imagine. His wife watched him closely, her expression unreadable. There was no triumph in her gaze, no satisfaction, only a quiet resignation, as though she had long known this moment would arrive and had already endured its weight in solitude. Her silence spoke volumes. She did not need to accuse or explain. The child itself had done that work more effectively than words ever could. The owner handed the child back abruptly, his movements stiff. He stepped away, creating distance where moments earlier he had sought closeness. His thoughts raced, colliding with years of certainty now rendered fragile. He remembered the laughter, the jokes, the ease with which he had dismissed suspicion. Each memory returned sharper, heavier, transformed from proof of strength into evidence of blindness. Downstairs, news of the birth spread quickly, but celebration remained muted. Those who glimpsed the child understood immediately why. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, eyes lowered, expressions carefully controlled. The house, once loud with the rhythms of daily life, seemed to retreat into itself. Even the walls appeared to listen. The owner retreated to his study, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. Inside, surrounded by symbols of authority, ledgers, maps, documents bearing his name, he confronted a truth he could no longer mock. The child's eyes replayed in his mind, refusing to be reshaped into something harmless. He thought of the man his wife had once spoken of only indirectly, the presence he had ignored so completely. For the first time, that absence became meaningful. He told himself again that this was impossible, that biology and order were on his side. Yet repetition no longer brought comfort. The certainty he had relied on felt hollow, unable to withstand even the smallest doubt. Now that doubt had a face, he realized with sudden clarity that laughter had never erased suspicion. It had only delayed the moment when denial would become unbearable. Upstairs, his wife lay quietly, listening to the house settle into uneasy stillness. The child slept beside her, unaware of the significance carried within his small body. She felt neither relief nor victory, only exhaustion. The truth she had sensed for so long had finally taken form, not through confrontation but through inevitability. What had been dismissed as imagination now existed beyond argument. As evening approached, the plantation resumed its routines, but nothing felt the same. The owner emerged eventually, composed but altered. His posture remained upright, his expression controlled, yet something fundamental had shifted. Those who looked closely could see it, the absence of ease, the weight of unspoken knowledge. He did not speak of the child's eyes, but he did not laugh either. That silence marked the end of certainty. The birth that was meant to affirm his world had instead exposed its fragility. In the quiet that followed, one truth became impossible to ignore. Lineage, pride, and authority could all be undone by something as simple, as undeniable, as the gaze of a newborn child. In the days following the birth, the plantation settled into a strained imitation of normalcy. Routines resumed because they had to. Fields still needed tending, meals still needed serving, but beneath the surface everything had shifted. The child's eyes had introduced a question no one dared to ask Aloe. Yet everyone carried it with them. Silence became the dominant language of the house, thick and deliberate, shaping every interaction. What had once been dismissed as imagination now moved freely through corridors and across verandas, present in every lowered gaze and every conversation that ended too quickly. The owner sensed this change immediately, though he refused to acknowledge it openly. He walked the grounds with the same measured steps, issued orders with the same tone of authority, but his awareness had sharpened uncomfortably. He noticed how people looked away when he approached, how conversations paused not out of respect but caution. It unsettled him more than open defiance ever could have. These people knew something, or believed they did, and their restraint felt like judgment disguised as obedience. He began to replay moments from the past. Memories he had once considered insignificant now demanding re-evaluation. He recalled the man his wife had mentioned indirectly, the one whose presence had blended so seamlessly into the household that he had barely registered him at all. At the time, he had seen no reason to question such a figure. Men like that were meant to fade into the background, defined by utility rather than individuality. Yet now, absence itself felt like a clue. How had someone so invisible become so central to a truth he could no longer ignore? Without announcing his intentions, the owner started paying closer attention. He watched movements instead of directing them, listened rather than speaking. This change did not go unnoticed. Those who worked the plantation sensed the shift and grew more careful. Every action felt weighted, every word measured. The unspoken understanding deepened. Something had changed, and it was dangerous to be careless. He noticed how certain people avoided specific parts of the house, how others lingered longer than necessary near the nursery before quickly moving on. He observed the way his wife's expressions softened around the child, not with fear or guilt, but with something closer to acceptance. This unsettled him profoundly. He had expected denial, perhaps even desperation. Instead, she seemed calm in a way that suggested resolution rather than concealment. The man behind the child's eyes began to take shape not through direct evidence, but through patterns. The owner noticed how one absence felt heavier than others. A familiar presence no longer moved through the periphery of his days. Tasks once handled efficiently were now distributed among others, as though deliberately. This absence was not announced or explained, it was simply accepted. That acceptance disturbed him more than any open accusation could have. He questioned a few people indirectly, framing his inquiries as casual curiosity. The answers he received were polite, vague, carefully empty. No one lied outright, but no one offered clarity either. It became clear that truth, whatever its exact form, was being protected, not aggressively, but collectively. This was not a conspiracy born of rebellion, it was a quiet consensus shaped by necessity and fear. He realized then that authority did not guarantee access to truth, it only guaranteed compliance. At night, alone in his study, he allowed himself to think more freely. He imagined the man whose eyes he had seen reflected in the child's gaze. He searched his memory for moments of recognition, shared glances, subtle familiarity, anything that might explain what now felt inevitable. The more he searched, the clearer it became that his blindness had been willful. He had chosen not to see because seeing would have required acknowledgement of limits he had never accepted. His wife said nothing, yet her silence felt intentional rather than submissive. She did not attempt to defend herself, nor did she offer explanations. In her restraint, there was a quiet assertion of truth that unsettled him deeply. She had spoken once, and he had laughed. Now she seemed to understand that words were no longer necessary. Reality had spoken more clearly than either of them ever could. Gradually, fragments of the truth emerged. not through confession but through convergence. Small details aligned too precisely to dismiss. A look shared too knowingly, a name avoided rather than forgotten, a path through the grounds no longer used. The owner began to understand that the truth was not hidden in one dramatic revelation, but dispersed across countless small decisions made by people who had learned long ago how to survive by withholding rather than confronting. He felt anger rise, but it lacked direction. Whom could he confront? The man himself was gone, removed not by punishment or escape, but by quiet agreement. To accuse now would be to expose himself, to admit that his authority had been bypassed, his certainty undermined. Pride warred with the need for clarity, and pride, though weakened, still held power over him. The household's collective silence forced him into an unfamiliar position, observer rather than ruler. He watched his world continue without his full understanding, and it terrified him. The plantation, once an extension of his will, now felt like a place that contained truths independent of him. This realization marked a profound shift. Power, he began to understand, could command behavior, but it could not command reality. The child grew stronger each day, and with each passing moment, the resemblance became harder to deny. The eyes did not change, they deepened, gaining focus, reflecting light in a way that stirred recognition even in those who tried to look away. The owner avoided prolonged contact, afraid of what prolonged observation might force him to accept. Yet even avoidance could not erase what had already been seen. Eventually the name surfaced, not spoken aloud, but acknowledged in glances exchanged when the owner was absent. It existed in shared memory, carried quietly among those who had known all along. The man behind the eyes was no longer just a suspicion, he was a presence felt through absence, defined by the space he left behind. His story intertwined with the plantation's history in ways the owner had never allowed himself to imagine. The owner realized with growing unease that uncovering the full truth would not restore his authority. It would only expose its fragility. There was no version of revelation that ended with his certainty intact. To confront the truth openly would be to admit that his laughter had not been strength, but avoidance, that his pride had not protected him, but blinded him. And so the truth remained suspended, visible yet unspoken, acknowledged yet unresolved. The plantation lived with it, adapted to it, carried it forward in silence. The man behind the child's eyes did not need to be named to exist. He lived on in recognition, in memory, in the quiet understanding that some truths did not require declaration to hold power. By the time the owner fully grasped this, it was already too late to change what had been set in motion. The child's presence had altered the structure of the household more profoundly than any confrontation ever could have. Authority remained, but certainty was gone. And in that absence, the truth, patient, undeniable, continued to breathe. Time did not soften the truth, it sharpened it. As weeks turned into months, the plantation owner learned that denial could survive shock, but not endurance. The child grew, slowly shedding the fragility of infancy, and with each small change, each widening gaze, each moment of foe. The resemblance that had first unsettled him, deepened into something undeniable. What had once been a single, shocking detail became a continuous presence, woven into the rhythms of daily life. The eyes were no longer a fleeting glimpse in a tense room, they were there in the morning light, in the quiet of the nursery, in the reflective stillness of dusk. They looked back at him not with accusation but with existence, and that was what made them unbearable. The owner tried at first to reclaim the certainty he had lost by doubling down on control. He immersed himself in work, extending his days in the fields, scrutinizing ledgers, issuing instructions with renewed firmness. He believed that if he could restore order everywhere else, the disorder within him might quiet itself. But authority, once cracked, does not mend easily. His commands were obeyed, yet they no longer reassured him. Compliance felt mechanical, detached from the respect he once assumed was inherent. The plantation moved because it had to, not because it believed in him. His wife watched this transformation with a steady calm that unsettled him more than anger ever could have. She did not press him, nor did she retreat into fear. Instead, She occupied her role with a quiet assurance, focusing her attention on the child and the household's inner balance. In her presence, there was no triumph, no visible satisfaction at having been proven right. If anything, she seemed weighed down by a sadness that suggested she had always known the cost of truth. Her composure forced him to confront a painful realization: she had not wanted this outcome. She had warned him not to assert superiority, but to prevent this very unraveling. The child became the center around which the household reorganized itself. Care was given carefully, deliberately, as though everyone understood that this life carried more significance than most. The owner noticed how people softened around the child, how their movements became gentler, their voices lower. This tenderness did not feel like loyalty to him. It felt like allegiance to something older and deeper than ownership. He recognized, with bitter clarity, that while he held power over the plantation, he did not own the truth embodied in that child. Shame settled into him gradually, replacing anger with something heavier and more enduring. It was not the kind of shame that sought confession or absolution. It was internal, corrosive, eroding the foundation of his identity. He thought of the laughter that had once come so easily, the dismissive jokes, the certainty with which he had reduced his wife's concern to foolishness. Those memories no longer protected him, they condemned him. Each recollection felt like evidence of his own blindness, his unwillingness to listen, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he lacked humility. He began to understand that pride had shaped his life more thoroughly than he had ever admitted. It had dictated how he saw others, how he saw himself, and how he defined truth. Pride had taught him that authority equaled correctness, that doubt was an affront rather than a signal. Now, stripped of its protective illusions, that pride left him exposed. He could not undo the past, could not rewrite the laughter into listening. All he could do was endure the consequences of having refused to see. The plantation, too, reflected this shift. Though nothing outwardly dramatic occurred, relationships subtly realigned. People no longer looked to the owner for moral certainty. They looked to stability, to continuity, to the quiet strength of those who had learned to survive without recognition. The household adapted around the truth of the child without ever naming it, creating a new equilibrium that did not depend on the owner's approval. This adaptation was perhaps the deepest wound of all. It showed him that life could proceed without his certainty at its center. In moments of solitude, he confronted questions he had never allowed himself to ask. What did it mean to be a father? Was lineage defined solely by blood, or by acknowledgement and responsibility? He found no comfort in these questions, only complexity. The child, after all, had not chosen any of this. The burden of consequence lay entirely with the adults who had shaped the circumstances of his birth. For the first time, the owner felt the weight of responsibility without the shield of authority to deflect it. He considered briefly exposing the truth openly, forcing confession, reclaiming narrative control through confrontation. But each time he approached that possibility, he recoiled. Such an act would not restore his pride, it would only display its failure. Public revelation would fracture what remained of stability, harming those who had already borne the cost of his blindness. He realized then that some acts of power were indistinguishable from cruelty, and that restraint, though humiliating, might be the closest thing to responsibility he could still claim. The child's presence became a mirror he could not escape. In quiet moments, when the house was still and the light softened, he found himself watching from a distance, observing the way the child's gaze followed movement, absorbed faces, reflected curiosity. There was no malice there, no judgment, only life, unfolding without regard for the pride it had dismantled. This realization unsettled him deeply. It meant that the reckoning he faced was not imposed by fate or betrayal alone, but by his own refusal to listen when it mattered. Over time, his wife's silence transformed into something he finally understood, not submission, but resolution. She had accepted the truth long before he had, not because it was easy, but because resisting it had cost her too much. Her strength lay not in confrontation, but in endurance. Seeing this, he recognized that his laughter had not only dismissed her suspicions, it had dismissed her humanity. That understanding cut deeper than any external judgment ever could. The plantation owner aged visibly during this period, though the change was subtle. His posture remained upright, his demeanor composed, but the ease with which he once inhabited his role never returned. He became quieter, more observant, less inclined to assert dominance where it was unnecessary. Some mistook this change for wisdom, others for fatigue. Only he knew that it was consequence, an internal reckoning that could not be shared without unraveling what little remained intact. In the end, the child grew into a living truth that required no explanation. The eyes that had first silenced laughter continued to speak without words, carrying forward a story shaped by secrecy, pride, and inevitability. The owner learned to live alongside that truth, though it never became comfortable. He learned, too late, that certainty imposed through power was fragile, and that laughter used to dismiss doubt could echo back with devastating clarity. There was no moment of dramatic resolution, no confession that restored balance. The reckoning was quiet, persistent, and deeply personal. It unfolded not in public judgment, but in private understanding. The plantation remained standing, the routines continued, and life moved forward. Yet beneath it all lay a transformed reality, one in which pride had been exposed, certainty dismantled, and truth allowed to exist without permission. And so, the story did not end with punishment or redemption, but with awareness. The plantation owner lived on, changed by a truth he could neither deny nor fully repair. The child lived on as well, carrying within him a history that would shape his future in ways no one could yet predict. Between them lay the enduring lesson that laughter, when used to silence doubt, does not destroy truth. It only delays the moment when truth demands to be seen.